When we think about God as a judge in the Hebrew Bible, what's the first image that pops into your head? For most of us, it's probably a king, right? Sitting on a throne, handing down these grand verdicts. But what if I told you that's just one piece of a much bigger, much more personal puzzle? Today, we're going to dig into that story and explore all the different ways ancient people understood and cried out for divine justice, far beyond the palace gates.
This line from the book of Judges is famous for a reason. It just perfectly captures this deep-seated anxiety that without a strong central ruler, everything just falls into chaos. It really sets up the king as the hero of the story, the one who's going to bring order and justice. But was the king really the only way people could find justice? Let's find out.
Okay, so here's how we're going to break this down. First, we'll tackle that familiar royal model. Then we'll get really personal and look at how individuals cried out for justice. From there, we'll zoom out to see how things worked in the community, uncover some, well, pretty surprising judges, and then tie it all together to see what this tells us about a really core belief. All right, first stop, the royal model. This is the one we all kind of know. The idea that justice is something that flows down from the very top, from the king, who is the ultimate authority in the land. And this link between kings and justice, it was so deep that it was literally built into people's names. Take the name Melchizedek. It actually means my king is my justice. I mean, that's incredible. It just goes to show how intertwined these two ideas were in everyone's minds.
And this is a really big but. That's not the whole story, not by a long shot. The scholar Mark Brettler points out something fascinating. He says the role of judging was never just about the king. And get this, most of the time when the texts talk about God's judgment, they don't even mention his kingship. That's a huge clue, right? It tells us we've got to look way beyond the palace walls to really understand what's going on.
And that leads us right here. We're about to make a big pivot, away from the grand, public stage of the royal court and into the much more intimate, private world of the family, the home, and the individual.
So you can see the contrast we're drawing here. It's a huge shift in perspective. We're moving from the big machinery of the state, the throne, the kingdom, all that administration, and we're zooming right in on the basic building blocks of a person's life, their family, their prayers, even their own name.
And speaking of names, just look at these. They're basically tiny little prayers that people carried with them their entire lives. Shepatayahu means Yahweh has rendered justice. Think about that. Or Sidkiyahu, my justice is Yahweh. These aren't just names. They are powerful, personal statements of faith in a God who gets involved. This kind of family language is just so powerful. Sure, the idea of a king protecting the weak is great, but this verse from Psalm 68 makes it so much more personal. God isn't some distant monarch. God is a father to orphans, a champion for widows. It's about a deep personal connection. And you can just feel the raw emotion pouring out of the Psalms. This is not some formal legal document being submitted to a court. It is a desperate, human cry. Execute justice for me, O Yahweh. It's a direct appeal from one heart to the ultimate divine judge. And we hear that same voice again in Lamentations. You've seen what they did to me. Give me justice. This isn't just some abstract idea about right and wrong. This is the real, painful cry of someone who's been wronged and is turning to God as their final and maybe only hope for a fair trial. Okay, so we've got the king on his throne and the individual crying out in prayer. Now, let's zoom out a bit and look at how justice actually worked on the ground. In the messy day-to-day reality of villages and families.
So yeah, how did it work? Honestly, that's a question historians are still wrestling with. The sources are pretty thin. We don't have stacks of ancient court records to go through. So what we have to do is piece together clues from stories, from law codes, from what we know about similar societies. And when we piece those clues together, a few key places start to pop up. A lot of stuff was probably handled right inside the household by the head of the family. If it was a dispute between families, maybe a group of kinsmen would get together. And for bigger issues, you might find the town elders meeting at the city gate to hear a case. And this is where it gets really cool, because it shows how history is this living, breathing conversation. Scholars are looking at the exact same stories and coming up with different takes. Take the story of Judah and Tamar. One interpretation says, look, Judah is acting as the paterfamilias, the big boss of the family with total power. But then another group of scholars comes along and says, hang on, not so fast.
He looks more like just another person in a legal dispute with pretty limited rights. It's just a perfect example of how our picture of the past is never set in stone. All right, get ready for this next part, because we're about to uncover a group of legal authorities that really challenges a lot of the common ideas we have about this ancient world. It's pretty surprising. So first, I want you to look at this word, shopatah. It's a Hebrew word, and it's the feminine form of the word for judge. The fact that this word even exists tells you something important. The idea of a female judge wasn't unthinkable. And here she is, Deborah. The book of Judges doesn't mince words. It calls her a shopatah, a female judge. And it says the people of Israel literally came up to her for a legal decision. So she wasn't just some wise woman giving out friendly advice. No, she was a recognized judicial authority, holding court and delivering justice. But it's not just about Deborah. We have to look at the household, too. When you dig into the law codes, you see that mothers were often included in laws about parental authority. And, in a farming society, women's economic contributions were massive. The scholar Carol Myers argues this gave them a ton of informal power, and, crucially, at least some legal authority. This is the foundation that makes a public figure like Deborah possible. Okay, let's pull all of these different threads together. We've talked about the king, the individual, the community, even female judges. So, what does it all add up to? Well, it adds up to this. The idea of a just God wasn't some fancy concept that was just cooked up by the elites in the royal court. It was a deeply held belief that was woven into the fabric of society at every single level, from the top to the very bottom. So, just to quickly recap our journey here. We started with that classic royal ideal. Then we zoomed way in on the personal plea for justice we see in names and prayers. After that, we panned back out to the community level. And finally, we shined a light on those unsung arbiters like Deborah. And here's the real takeaway. When you find the same idea, this deep desire for a fair, active judge, popping up absolutely everywhere, in the palace, in the home, in men's names, in women's judicial roles, that tells you something fundamental. It shows you what that culture truly, deeply valued. And that value was justice. So I want to leave you with this final question to chew on. If this cry for justice was so universal, echoing from the king on his throne all the way down to the widow with nothing, what does that tell you about what a society truly values deep down? And maybe more importantly, what does it tell us about our own?